All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling pragmatism. You sent over this educational script, and
Yeah.
I gotta say, the more I dug into it, the more I realized it's all about truth in action. Yeah?
Yeah, it really is. Like, forget all those stuffy theories. Pragmatism is all about ideas actually working in the real world.
It's refreshing, isn't it? So
Absolutely.
instead of searching for some, ultimate truth, it's more about figuring out what actually helps us in our daily lives.
Exactly. Pragmatism kind of throws out the old rule book on how we think about truth. It embraces this idea that truth is flexible, always evolving. It changes based on what we experience and what we find useful.
So it's a philosophy that was born in the U.S.,
Yep, late 19th century.
and thinkers like Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey really pushed it forward, huh?
They did. Instead of getting lost in those abstract debates, they were all about, let's focus on the real consequences of our beliefs.
That makes sense. This idea the script mentions really caught my eye, this whole truth is what works thing.
Yeah.
What does that even mean, practically speaking? Is it really as simple as it sounds?
Well, it sounds simple, but there's a lot to unpack there. For pragmatists, an idea works if it has a genuine impact. Like, does it help us make sense of what we experience? Does it lead to positive outcomes? Does it solve problems instead of just creating more?
So it's this constant cycle. We have an idea, we test it out in the real world, we
Right.
see what happens, and then we use those results to refine our thinking. It's almost like the scientific method, but applied to philosophy, wouldn't you say?
That's a great connection. Pragmatists really value empiricism, that whole idea that knowledge comes from our experiences, not just from thinking about things.
And the scientific method, with all its testing and revising, fits right in there.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how this all fits together. So to recap, we're talking about rejecting this idea of absolute truth, focusing on the consequences of our beliefs, and really valuing what plays out in the real world.
You got it.
And at the heart of it all, we've got these big three: Peirce, James, and Dewey. Each brought their own perspective to pragmatism.
They did.
Let's start with Peirce. The script mentions this pragmatic maxim. Sounds kind of intense. What's that all about?
Well, the pragmatic maxim is basically Peirce's way of saying, if you want to really understand an idea, look at what happens if you believe it. What actions would you take? What would the consequences be? It's about going beyond just definitions and actually seeing how beliefs work in practice.
Can you give me an example? Sometimes I need something concrete to wrap my head around these things.
Sure, the script uses the example of a tree. We all picture a tree in our minds, right?
Right.
But for a pragmatist, it's not just that mental image, it's all the practical things that come with it. If you believe a tree is real, you act accordingly. You look for shade under it, you use its wood, maybe you even eat its fruit.
So it's less about the word tree itself
Hmm.
and more about everything that comes from believing in it and interacting with it.
Exactly. Peirce wants us to think about the actions and consequences that come from our beliefs. If this is true, then what? How does it change the way we live and interact with the world around us?
I see how Peirce set the stage. This focus on the real-world consequences. But what about William James? How did he build on these ideas?
James really dug into the relationship between belief and action. He had this great quote: "The truth of an idea is not a stagnant property inherent in it, but an event in the process of verification through experience." Basically, he was all about how what we believe drives what we do, and then what we do shapes how we understand truth.
So for James, it's about engaging with the world and testing our beliefs, not just accepting some truth that's already out there. I mean, how many times have we believed something? Then something happens that totally changes our minds.
All the time, right? James was fascinated by that individual journey, how our beliefs shape our choices and ultimately shape our lives. For him, truth wasn't some distant idea. It was all about how it plays out for each person.
This is such a different way to think about philosophy. Okay, so Peirce focused on the practical consequences. James brought in this whole personal experiential element. So where does John Dewey fit into all of this?
Well, Dewey was all about taking pragmatism and applying it to real-world problems, especially in education and social reform. He believed that real learning comes from actually doing things,
Mm.
experimenting and learning from your experiences.
Yeah, that learning by doing thing. I've always liked that approach. It's like reading about something is one thing, but until you get your hands dirty and try it out for yourself, you're not really learning.
Exactly. Dewey thought education should be about problem-solving, critical thinking, preparing people to actually participate in society, not just memorizing facts.
He wanted people to use what they learn to make a real difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's amazing how each of these thinkers brought something unique to pragmatism. Peirce with his focus on the consequences, James with the personal experience element, and Dewey with his passion for hands-on learning and social change.
It really shows the breadth of the philosophy.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. The script doesn't just talk about theory. It shows how pragmatism actually plays out in different areas.
That's the best way to learn.
I love seeing how these ideas work in the real world. So where should we start?
Well, the script highlights science as a prime example.
Right. Like we talked about earlier, the connection to the scientific method.
Yeah.
It's all about testing and observing and refining.
Exactly. Pragmatists kind of see scientists as these ultimate truth seekers. They're constantly testing and revising their theories based on what they observe.
Right.
But they're not claiming to have found some absolute truth. They're developing models that are useful in specific contexts.
Always looking for a better, more accurate understanding.
Exactly.
And that's where the focus on consequences comes in.
Yeah.
A scientific theory isn't judged just on how clever it is. It's about whether it actually predicts what's going to happen, whether it helps us solve problems. Makes total sense. Science isn't the only area where pragmatism shows up. The script also talks about ethics. Seems like a trickier area to apply this philosophy, don't you think?
Yeah, it can be a bit trickier. Pragmatism's approach to ethics is a little different from some other schools of thought.
How so?
Well, instead of searching for universal moral rules that apply all the time, pragmatists look at ethical decisions in a more, I guess you could say, nuanced way.
So what makes something right or wrong isn't always the same. It depends on the situation.
That's the idea. They'd argue that the most ethical choice is the one that leads to the best outcome, the greatest good in a given situation.
Right.
It's about looking at the potential consequences, choosing the actions that will make things better.
So it's less about following a strict set of rules and more about considering the specific circumstances, trying to find the most beneficial solution.
Exactly. And that allows for more flexibility, which is important when you're dealing with tough ethical choices.
This is making me rethink how I make decisions. So we've covered science and ethics. What other areas does the script talk about?
Well, it mentions politics and social change.
All right, let's get political. How does a philosophy that's all about practicality work in politics? Politics is often driven by ideology.
Right, but pragmatism can cut through all of that. It's about focusing on what actually works to solve problems, finding solutions that benefit everyone, not getting bogged down in ideological battles.
So it's more important to find real solutions than to stick to your ideology no matter what.
Exactly. Pragmatists in politics are more likely to ask, what's actually going to make people's lives better?
That's refreshing.
It encourages experimentation and adaptation in the political process. If something isn't working, you try something new.
Makes sense.
It's about constantly striving for better results, not being tied to a fixed set of beliefs.
So you can have strong convictions, but also be open to changing your mind based on what you see happening.
Absolutely. Now, it's important to remember that pragmatism has its critics.
Of course, no philosophy is perfect.
Right.
What are some of the main criticisms of pragmatism?
Well, one concern is that this focus on what works could lead to relativism. If we're always adjusting our understanding of truth, some people worry that we might lose sight of objective reality.
So, if truth is always changing, how do we know what's really right or wrong?
That's the worry. Some critics argue that a purely pragmatic approach could lead to the ends justify the means kind of thinking.
I can see how that would be a concern. Are there any other major criticisms?
Another critique is that pragmatism might lead us to undervalue abstract ideas.
Okay.
We might get so focused on immediate results that we forget about the bigger picture or the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake.
So we might be so busy fixing the little things that we forget to look at the big picture.
That's one way to put it. Critics argue that there's value in exploring abstract concepts, even if they don't have an immediate practical use.
That's a good point. It seems like there's this tension in pragmatism, this focus on action and results, but also the potential for neglecting things like reflection and abstract thought.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's like we've uncovered this tension between, being practical and getting things done, and maybe missing out on those bigger questions.
Right, and maybe even making decisions that aren't ethical because we're so focused on results.
Exactly. But, pragmatists wouldn't necessarily disagree with those criticisms. They'd say that even our most abstract ideas come from our experiences in the world. It's not about ignoring those big questions. It's about recognizing that they're always connected to how we act and what we do.
So it's not that those abstract ideas are unimportant, it's more about grounding them in reality.
Right, exactly. It's like you can think about the nature of truth all day long, but what really matters is how that understanding actually affects your life, how it shapes your choices and impacts the world around you.
Okay, I'm seeing how pragmatism brings together theory and practice,
It's both, really.
not one or the other.
Right.
But I think our listeners are probably wondering how this applies to their own lives.
Oh, absolutely.
What would you say is the biggest takeaway from this deep dive?
Well, here's a question to think about. What if, instead of always searching for absolute certainty, we embrace the idea that truth is always changing? Truth evolves as we experience more things. How would that change how you approach everyday decisions? How would it change how you deal with challenges?
That's a great question. It's like we're being challenged to see the world as this puzzle that's always changing. We're always getting new information. We have to keep testing our assumptions and refining what we understand. What happens when we get comfortable with not knowing everything?
It can be really freeing. Instead of clinging to beliefs that might not be working anymore, we can become more adaptable, more open to different perspectives, more willing to learn from our mistakes.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I feel like I need to go write down some of these ideas. Pragmatism could really change how we approach life.
I think so too. And remember, if it doesn't work for you, you can always change your approach.
That's the pragmatic way, right?
Always learning, always adapting, always finding what works best. Well, that's it for our deep dive into pragmatism. We've explored how this philosophy encourages us to think about truth, not as some fixed idea, but as something that we create through what we do and what we experience. Big thanks to our expert for this incredible deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep those actions inspired.